Part 8. The Political Pivot and Department of Government Efficiency, 2024-2025. Chapter 71. The 2024 Election. The Largest Political Donor. The rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, had barely ended when Musk posted. The image was still resolving in the collective consciousness of a stunned nation. Donald Trump, fist raised, blood on his ear, Secret Service agents swarming the stage, a shooter dead on a rooftop, when Musk typed the words that several 100 million people would read within the hour. He endorsed Donald Trump for President of the United States. The post was not careful. It did not carry the hedged language of a businessman protecting his regulatory relationships, or the calibrated ambiguity of a man who had spent decades navigating the political neutrality that access to federal contracts demands. It was direct, immediate, and timed with the instinct of someone who understood, at a level that most political professionals had not yet fully absorbed, that the moment of maximum emotional intensity was the moment of maximum persuasive force. In the hours after an assassination attempt, when the country was still processing what it had witnessed, when the images of Trump's raised fist had already begun their transformation from news photograph to political icon, Musk had chosen his side with a decisiveness that made everything that followed feel, in retrospect, inevitable. Even though, for most of the people who had watched him operate over the preceding decade, it had been anything but. He had been, for most of his public life, a man without a conventional political home. The contextual pressure of the 2024 election cycle on Elon Musk cannot be understood without reckoning with what the preceding 4 years had done to his relationship with the American regulatory state. The Biden administration had arrived in January of 2021 with an agenda that included, at its center, a transition to electric vehicles, a goal that might have seemed in the abstract like good news for the founder of Tesla. In practice, the relationship between Musk and the administration had been, from early days, characterized by a studied mutual coldness that gradually hardened into something more adversarial. Musk had not been invited to the White House Electric Vehicle Summit in August of 2021, an exclusion that he noted publicly and that the administration never satisfactorily explained. The infrastructure legislation and the Inflation Reduction Act had directed EV subsidies through frameworks that advantaged unionized manufacturers, a structure that Tesla, which had successfully resisted United Auto Workers organizing efforts, could not fully access in the way that General Motors and Ford could. The FAA had delayed Starship launch licenses with a thoroughness that Musk described with increasing vehemence as regulatory sabotage. The SEC had maintained an investigative posture toward his public communications that felt from inside his organization like institutional harassment. OSHA had opened multiple investigations into SpaceX workplace safety practices. The NLRB had pursued claims against Tesla's labor practices. The accumulated weight of these engagements had produced in Musk a conviction, whether entirely rational or partially self-serving, it was deeply felt, that the federal government under Democratic administration had made the decision to treat him as an adversary. The political journey had moved in stages. He had voted Democratic for most of his adult life, or at least had said so. By 2022, he was describing himself as a political independent, announcing that he would be voting Republican in the midterms, offering explanations that centered on his concerns about what he called the radicalization of the Democratic Party and the suppression of free speech by institutions he associated with the left. By 2023, the evolution had accelerated. His acquisition of Twitter and its transformation into X had been accompanied by a systematic reorientation of his own public voice, the amplification of conservative commentators, the reinstatement of right-wing accounts, the algorithmic adjustments that critics documented as systematically promoting his own posts, and the posts of figures whose politics aligned with his emerging positions. And by the spring of 2024, as the presidential primary season resolved itself into the contest between Trump and Biden that most observers had anticipated, Musk was no longer performing political independence. He was, with the commitment of a recent convert, who has not yet developed the habits of restraint that longer-tenured believers learn, becoming the most powerful private sector voice in the American right. The core conflict of his political engagement was structural, and it was the same conflict that had defined every major move of his career, the collision between the scale of his ambition and the resistance of existing systems to being disrupted by it. American political culture had developed, over the course of a century of big money involvement in elections, a set of informal norms about the appropriate distance between concentrated private wealth and direct political intervention. Norms that the Citizens United decision had legally dismantled, but that continued to exert a gravitational pull on the behavior of most major donors. The expectation was that very large political contributions would be laundered through at least the formal appearance of ideological advocacy, through super PACs with patriotic names and stated policy missions, through the deliberate maintenance of some separation between the donor's personal brand and the candidate's campaign. Musk had no patience for this performance. He gave directly, publicly, and at a scale that made the indirection seem not just unnecessary but dishonest. His contribution to America PAC, the political action committee he founded specifically to support Trump's 2024 campaign, would ultimately exceed $250 million, a figure that exceeded the combined political giving of every other major donor in the cycle, and that represented, in its sheer magnitude, a new data point in American democratic history. But the money, though staggering, was almost secondary to the platform. X had, by 2024, become something that Twitter had never been under its previous management, an instrument of explicit political alignment. The changes were both structural and behavioral. Musk's own posting frequency had increased to a rate that some researchers estimated at dozens of posts per day, a torrent of commentary, amplification, mockery, and advocacy that covered the full range of conservative political positions: immigration restriction, hostility to DAI programs, skepticism of climate science as practiced by governmental bodies, contempt for mainstream media, support for Trump's legal battles against what Musk consistently characterized as a weaponized justice system. His account had a following that no other individual on the platform could approach, and the reach of his posts was amplified by algorithmic systems that his own engineers had built, and that his critics documented with receipts, as preferentially boosting his content over that of accounts with comparable or larger organic followings. The platform he had purchased as a free speech absolutist had become, in the assessment of multiple, independent researchers, the most powerful editorial apparatus in American media, one edited by its owner in real time in public, with no pretense of the neutrality that legacy media had maintained, however imperfectly, as a professional standard. The revealing action, the moment that functioned as a keyhole into the whole of what Musk had become by the fall of 2024, came not in a dramatic public gesture but in a decision so procedurally audacious that its implications took days to fully register. In the final weeks before the election, America PAC launched a sweepstake in swing states, offering registered voters who signed a petition supporting the First and Second Amendments a daily prize of $1 million, drawn by lottery from the petition's signatories. The legal questions were immediate and pointed. The Justice Department issued a warning suggesting the promotion might constitute an illegal lottery. Multiple state attorneys general opened investigations. Legal scholars debated whether offering money contingent on voter registration crossed the line that election law drew around electoral inducement. Musk responded to the legal challenges the way he responded to all legal challenges, by posting about the program on X, by personally presenting the daily checks on stage at campaign events with the theatrical enthusiasm of a game show host who had decided that American democracy needed a different kind of engagement. The stunt was, depending on one's vantage point, either a creative exploitation of a legal gray area or an assault on the integrity of the electoral process, and the fact that it was difficult to determine which, that the law had not anticipated an actor with these specific resources and this specific indifference to the norms surrounding them, was itself the point. Musk operated most naturally in the gap between what the rules prohibited and what they had never thought to address. The relationship with Trump himself was, by November of 2024, the most consequential personal alliance Musk had formed since his early partnerships in the founding years of PayPal. It had not always seemed like an alliance that would develop to this depth. Musk's public posture toward Trump during the first administration had been intermittently critical. He had resigned from 2 presidential advisory councils in 2017 over the administration's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, a decision that had seemed at the time to mark him as a man whose business interests in renewable energy would keep him in permanent tension with Trump's fossil fuel politics. The relationship had remained distant through Trump's first term and through the Biden years. What changed it, according to people close to both men, was a combination of the regulatory hostility Musk had experienced under Biden, the ideological journey that X had accelerated, and a series of personal conversations in 2023 and early 2024 that had revealed, to both men's apparent surprise, a depth of mutual regard that their public histories had not predicted. Trump, who had made the humiliation of people he considered disloyal into an art form, had referred to Musk dismissively in the early post-Twitter period. Musk had not been a Trump supporter during the 2020 campaign. What bound them, ultimately, was not ideology in the traditional sense but temperament, a shared conviction that the institutions arrayed against them were corrupt, and that the willingness to absorb and return institutional hostility was itself a form of strength. By the night of November 5, 2024, when the electoral results made clear that Trump had won the presidency, carrying Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and enough of the remaining map to produce an electoral college result that was, by the standards of recent cycles, relatively decisive, Musk was on stage at Mar-a-Lago with the expression of a man who had bet everything on a single hand and watched it come in. He bounced, literally bounced, with an unguarded physical joy that seemed to surprise even the people who knew him well. His post on X that night was simple and direct in the way that his best communications always were, stripped of the ironic layering that characterized his ordinary online voice. He had helped elect a president of the United States. The sentence, held in the mind for a moment, carried a weight that the celebration had not yet paused to fully examine. What would follow? The appointment, in the transition period, of Musk to lead a new advisory body that Trump called the Department of Government Efficiency. Its acronym a joke that both men appeared to find genuinely funny. Its mandate the reduction of federal spending and the dismantling of regulatory infrastructure that Musk had spent years describing as the primary obstacle to American dynamism, was, in retrospect, the logical destination of everything that had accumulated since the Butler rally endorsement. He had given money on a scale no private citizen had given before. He had provided a platform that had functioned in the final months of the campaign as the dominant communications infrastructure of the American right. He had given his own time and presence, appearing at rallies, posting at volumes that required either a dedicated communications staff or a genuinely unusual relationship with sleep, conducting interviews on his own platform that gave Trump access to audiences that conventional campaign media could not reach. The return on this investment, measured in the currency that Musk actually valued, access, influence, the ability to reshape the institutions he believed were failing, was about to be calculated. And the calculation would take place inside the federal government itself, in agencies and departments and regulatory bodies, whose legal and structural independence from executive direction had been assumed by most observers of American governance to be largely beyond the reach of any single actor, however wealthy, however powerful, however certain of his own indispensability to the future of human civilization. What those observers had not fully accounted for was that Musk had never, in any domain he had entered, accepted the limits that prior actors had treated as fixed, and that the Department of Government Efficiency, which had no statutory authority, no formal legal standing, and no precedent in American administrative history, was about to discover, along with the rest of the country, exactly what happened when someone with his particular combination of resources, temperament, and conviction decided that the federal government was simply another legacy system awaiting disruption, and that the people inside it, who believed their institutional protections would hold, had not yet met anyone quite like the man who was coming. Chapter 72. The DOGE Appointment, Leading Government Efficiency. The chainsaw was real. That was the first thing to understand about the moment. It was not a prop in the theatrical sense, not a foam replica or a stage device borrowed from a television production designer. It was an actual chainsaw, orange-handled, its teeth exposed, and Musk held it above his head at the Conservative Political Action Conference in late February of 2025, with the specific delight of a man who had discovered that the metaphor he had been reaching for all his life had a physical form, and that the physical form was available at a hardware store, and that wielding it in front of an audience of several thousand conservative activists while the cameras of every major news organization captured the image for global distribution was, in his assessment, Exactly the correct thing to do at exactly this moment in American history. The crowd roared. Argentine President Javier Milei, who had brought the chainsaw to Washington as a symbol of his own government's austerity campaign, and presented it to Musk with the fellowship of ideological kinship, grinned at the spectacle. And Musk, 60 days into the most operationally consequential appointment of his career, stood in the lights with the chainsaw over his head and looked for a moment like a man who had decided that the distance between governing and performing was a distinction only losers maintained. He had come to Washington differently than anyone before him. The inauguration of Donald Trump on January 20, 2025, had been, for Musk, not a culmination, but a beginning, the moment at which the campaign's investment converted into operational authority, when the abstraction of political influence became the concrete reality of access to the machinery of the federal government. The transition period between the election and the inauguration had been consumed with the architecture of what Trump had announced, with a casualness that belied its structural radicalism, as the Department of Government Efficiency. The name was a deliberate provocation, its acronym a cryptocurrency reference that Trump and Musk both found amusing, and that their critics found revealing in ways neither man appeared particularly concerned about. DOGE was not a department in any statutory sense. It had no enabling legislation, no confirmed budget, no legal authority derived from an act of Congress. It was, in the formal language of administrative law, an advisory body, a presidential commission of the kind that had existed in various forms throughout American history, charged with making recommendations that executive agencies could choose to implement or ignore. This formal description was, from the first days of its operation, almost entirely fictional as an account of what DOGE actually did. What DOGE actually did, in the weeks following the inauguration, was move. The speed was the first weapon. Musk had imported from his corporate operations a philosophy of organizational change that held as its central axiom that the primary advantage of an attacker over an entrenched institution was velocity, that established systems could not adapt to disruption faster than disruption could be applied, provided the disruptor was willing to absorb the legal and political consequences of moving before the opposition had organized. At Tesla, this had meant production decisions made and reversed within weeks, organizational structures rebuilt quarterly, engineers given authority that corporate hierarchies normally reserve for executives 3 levels above their grade. At Twitter, it had meant the elimination of roughly 80% of the workforce in the span of days, the immediate dismantling of content moderation infrastructure that had taken years to construct, the physical removal of server equipment before the legal challenges to the removals had been fully articulated. At DOGE, applied to the United States federal government, an institution employing roughly 3 million civilians, operating on an annual budget approaching $7 trillion, governed by a legal framework of extraordinary complexity built up over more than 2 centuries, the same philosophy produced consequences of a different order of magnitude entirely. The teams Musk deployed into federal agencies were young, technically proficient, and operating with a mandate whose legal basis was, in the assessment of virtually every administrative law scholar who examined it, deeply unclear. They arrived at the Office of Personnel Management, at the Treasury Department's payment systems, at USAID, at the Department of Education, carrying laptops and the implicit authority of presidential preference, and they began requesting access to databases, to payment systems, to personnel records, to the operational infrastructure through which the federal government disbursed approximately $6 trillion annually in payments to beneficiaries, contractors, and state governments. The access requests generated immediate legal challenges. Federal judges in multiple circuits issued temporary restraining orders. Career officials who refused access were fired or placed on administrative leave. Officials who provided access faced their own legal jeopardy, as career attorneys in the relevant agencies issued memos questioning whether DOGE's access to sensitive systems complied with the Privacy Act, the Federal Records Act, and a range of other statutory frameworks that governed how federal data could be handled and by whom. The core conflict was constitutional in the most precise sense. It concerned the allocation of power among the branches of government that the Constitution had established, and the question at its center was one that the framers had debated exhaustively and resolved, at least in their own minds, with considerable care. Congress appropriates money. The executive spends it, but only as Congress has directed. The president has broad discretion in the management of the executive branch, but that discretion is bounded by statute, and the statutes that govern federal employment, federal procurement, and federal payment systems had been constructed over decades specifically to constrain the ability of any single actor, including the president, to redirect or withhold congressionally appropriated funds based on political preference. What DOGE was attempting, the cancellation of contracts, the impoundment of appropriated funds, the mass termination of federal employees through mechanisms that bypassed the civil service protections Congress had legislated, ran directly into these constraints. The legal challenges accumulated with a speed that even experienced Washington litigators described as unprecedented, and the federal judiciary, which had developed its own institutional wariness about executive overreach across administrations of both parties, proved considerably less deferential to the DOGE enterprise than its architects had apparently anticipated. Musk's response to the judicial resistance was a version of what he always did when institutions pushed back. He attacked them publicly on X with the combination of factual assertion and rhetorical contempt that his platform delivered at maximum velocity. Judges who issued restraining orders against DOGE operations were named, their decisions characterized as corrupt or politically motivated, their personal histories excavated for material that could be used to undermine their authority in the court of public opinion, even when their legal authority remained intact in the courts of law. He called for the impeachment of judges who ruled against the administration. He amplified posts, characterizing the civil service as a class of parasitic bureaucrats whose primary function was to obstruct the legitimate exercise of democratic authority. The language was deliberately inflammatory, and it was effective in the specific sense that it generated the kind of political energy, the sense of embattled righteousness of a righteous campaign against entrenched corruption, that sustained the DOGE enterprise in the public imagination even as its legal foundations were being systematically challenged in courtrooms from Washington to San Francisco. The revealing action came in late January of 2025, when DOGE's access to the Treasury Department's payment systems, the infrastructure through which the federal government processes trillions of dollars in Social Security payments, veterans' benefits, Medicare reimbursements, and federal employee salaries, became public knowledge through a combination of court filings and investigative reporting. The access had been granted, under circumstances that remained disputed, to engineers affiliated with DOGE, who were, by the government's own accounting, contractors without the security clearances that the sensitivity of the systems would ordinarily require. The potential exposure, the possibility that the payment infrastructure for the entire American federal government had been accessed by individuals whose security vetting had not been completed, for purposes that had not been authorized by the officials legally responsible for the systems, produced a reaction in the national security community that crossed partisan lines in ways that most of DOGE's activities had not. Former Treasury officials, intelligence community veterans, and cybersecurity experts who had served in Republican and Democratic administrations alike described the situation in terms that ranged from alarming to catastrophic. Musk, informed of the concern, posted that the critics were lying, that DOGE's access had been entirely appropriate, and that the real story was the shocking waste and fraud that his teams had discovered once inside the systems. The competing claims could not both be true. The question of which was accurate would take months of litigation and investigation to resolve, and the resolution, when it came, would illuminate something important about the gap between what DOGE claimed to have accomplished and what it had actually done. Vivek Ramaswamy had been, in the earliest conception of DOGE, its co-leader, the other face of a venture that the Trump transition had initially presented as a partnership between two entrepreneurial disruptors with complementary skills. Ramaswamy, the pharmaceutical entrepreneur who had mounted a presidential primary campaign of his own before endorsing Trump and angling for a role in the administration, brought to the partnership a policy fluency and a constitutional framework that Musk, whose relationship with the details of administrative law was not his primary strength, nominally complemented. The partnership had lasted approximately 3 weeks past the inauguration, before Ramaswamy departed to pursue a run for governor of Ohio, citing a desire to engage in electoral politics directly. The accounts of what had actually happened between the two men during those weeks varied depending on the source, but the consistent thread was that the collaboration had not been, in practical terms, a collaboration. That Musk's operational style, which involved making decisions at a speed and with an authority that left no meaningful role for a co-equal partner, had made the partnership structurally impossible regardless of the personal dynamics involved. Ramaswamy's exit was handled publicly as an amicable transition. In the telling of people who had been in the room, it was something more complicated, evidence that Musk, who had never in his career operated as a genuine co-equal with anyone, had no mechanism for sharing the controls of an enterprise he had decided was his. After Ramaswamy's departure, DOGE was Musk's entirely, which meant it operated with the specific combination of energy and chaos that characterized all of his enterprises at their most exposed moments. The claimed savings figures, initially announced at targets of $2 trillion, then revised downward as the arithmetic was examined by independent analysts who found the underlying calculations unsupported, then revised again, became a running controversy that the administration's supporters dismissed as media bias and its critics cited as evidence that the entire operation was more performance than governance. The firings of federal employees, which had proceeded through a combination of voluntary separation incentives and involuntary terminations, generated legal challenges that restored significant numbers of dismissed workers to their positions through court order, producing the operationally absurd situation of employees who had been fired by DOGE, reinstated by federal judges, and then fired again through alternative mechanisms that their agency's lawyers hoped would survive the next round of judicial review. And through all of it, Musk posted. He posted about the deep state. He posted about waste and fraud. He posted about judges. He posted about journalists. He posted about the Federal Reserve and about specific agency officials by name, and about the accumulated corruptions of a government that had, in his telling, grown so far beyond any democratic mandate that dismantling it was not destruction but liberation. The posting was itself a form of governance, an attempt to shape the political conditions within which DOGE operated, to maintain the public pressure that gave the enterprise its momentum even as the legal pressure mounted against it. He was running a government efficiency initiative, the way he had run a product launch, on the theory that attention was the resource that mattered most, and that the willingness to generate controversy was the most reliable method of sustaining attention. It was, as a theory of political communication, not without empirical support. It was, as a theory of institutional reform, about to encounter the specific resistance that distinguishes government from industry, the resistance of a system designed at its constitutional foundations to frustrate exactly this kind of concentrated executive energy, and whose most powerful defenders had not yet fully mobilized, and whose response, when it came in the congressional hearing rooms and federal appellate courts of the spring of 2025, would force a reckoning with the question of whether the man holding the chainsaw had understood, before he raised it above his head to the roar of the crowd, that the thing he was cutting into had roots that went all the way down to the bedrock of the republic, and that bedrock, as several generations of would-be disruptors had discovered before him, did not yield to blades. Chapter 73. The Chainsaw for Bureaucracy, 9% Workforce Cuts. The email arrived on a Tuesday evening with a subject line that contained, in its entirety, the words, "Fork in the road." Federal employees across the country, in Washington and in field offices in Montana and Louisiana and Hawaii, in laboratories and national parks and veterans hospitals and air traffic control facilities, in every time zone the Republic occupied, opened it on their government-issued devices and read, with the specific quality of attention that people bring to documents that are reordering their lives in real time, a message that asked them to reply with a single word. The word was yes. Replying yes would constitute, in the formulation of the message, an affirmation that they had accomplished something meaningful in the previous week, and their continued employment would depend on this affirmation, and they had 48 hours to provide it, and failure to respond would be interpreted as a resignation. The message had no agency letterhead. It was not signed by the director of the Office of Personnel Management, or by any Senate-confirmed official who had been nominated by the President and approved by Congress to exercise authority over the federal workforce. It arrived, as best as career attorneys in multiple agencies could determine, in the hours following its transmission to roughly 2 million federal employees, from an infrastructure associated with operatives working under the direction of the Department of Government Efficiency. In the offices of federal employee unions, phones began ringing before the timestamp on the email had fully registered. In the chambers of federal judges in the District of Columbia, clerks began preparing dockets for the emergency filings that would arrive before dawn. Musk, by most accounts, slept fine. The winter and spring of 2025 had installed Elon Musk in a position without precedent in the history of the American administrative state, not because no private citizen had ever wielded significant influence over federal policy, which was a story as old as the Republic itself, but because no private citizen had ever done so with this particular combination of formal adjacency to executive power, personal operational control over the mechanisms of execution, and systematic contempt for the procedural constraints that the law had constructed specifically to prevent the concentration of administrative authority in hands that were not accountable to Congress or the courts. The fork-in-the-road email was one expression of this position, but it was not the first, and it was not the most consequential. What preceded it, and what accompanied it, and what followed it across 10 months of operations that would ultimately result in the departure of more than 271,000 federal employees, approximately 9% of the entire civilian federal workforce, was a campaign of institutional transformation that its architects described as the most significant restructuring of American government since the New Deal, and that its critics described with documentation as an assault on the constitutional order conducted at a speed designed to outrun the legal and political systems capable of stopping it. The pressure context of early 2025 was defined by a specific paradox that Musk appeared to find energizing rather than constraining. He was, simultaneously, the most powerful unelected figure in the American government, and the subject of more active federal litigation than any comparable actor in recent memory. Federal judges had issued dozens of temporary restraining orders against various DOGE initiatives within the first 60 days of the administration. The American Federation of Government Employees, the largest union representing federal workers, had filed suits in multiple jurisdictions. State attorneys general from California, from New York, from a coalition of 19 states whose legal resources combined represented a genuine counterweight to the administration's capacity to defend its actions, had mounted challenges to the mass terminations, to the impoundment of congressionally appropriated funds, to the dismantling of entire agencies whose existence had been established by statute. The legal community had mobilized in a way that it had not mobilized in a generation, with former solicitors general and retired federal judges and constitutional law professors appearing in courtrooms and on television to explain, with the careful precision of people who had spent careers thinking about these questions, why what DOGE was doing was not merely politically controversial but legally indefensible. And the courts, by and large, were agreeing with them, issuing injunctions restoring fired employees to their positions, blocking the termination of contracts that DOGE had sought to cancel. None of it slowed the pace of the cuts. The methodology was itself an argument. DOGE had imported from the private sector a concept that Silicon Valley called reduction in force, or RIF, and that the federal government's own civil service laws had surrounded with procedural requirements. Notice periods, appeals processes, union consultation obligations, redeployment procedures, designed precisely to prevent the kind of rapid, large-scale workforce elimination that Musk had executed at Twitter with such visible satisfaction. The workarounds his team developed were varied and, in their ingenuity, revealing about the legal sophistication of the people constructing them, even if the broader enterprise they served remained constitutionally dubious. Voluntary separation incentives, buyouts offered to employees who agreed to leave without contesting their departures, could be implemented without triggering the full procedural requirements of involuntary reduction in force. Probationary employees who lacked the full civil service protections of career staff could be terminated with fewer procedural constraints, and DOGE identified hundreds of thousands of employees in probationary status and moved against them with a speed that caught agency human resources departments entirely unprepared. Entire offices and bureaus whose statutory authorization was ambiguous were simply shuttered, their employees administratively reassigned to positions that had not yet been created. A bureaucratic limbo that accomplished in practice the same result as termination while complicating the legal challenges that termination would have provoked. The scale, by midsummer, had become a number that required a pause to absorb. 271,000 people. The population of a mid-sized American city, Orlando or St. Paul or Raleigh, suddenly without federal employment. They were air traffic controllers and food safety inspectors and veterans benefits processors and nuclear weapons maintenance technicians and park rangers and IRS auditors and NIH researchers and FEMA disaster response coordinators. They were, in the aggregate, the operational infrastructure through which the United States federal government performed the functions that its citizens had, through their elected representatives, directed it to perform. The argument that DOGE made, and made publicly on X, in press releases, in congressional testimony, was that the federal workforce had expanded far beyond any legitimate mandate, that the accumulated growth of decades had produced an apparatus of redundancy and inefficiency that cost the American taxpayer enormous sums for results that did not justify the expense, and that the cuts, though painful in their immediate human dimensions, were the prerequisite for a leaner and more effective government. The argument had a coherent internal logic, and it drew on a tradition of conservative thought about the proper scope of federal activity that extended back through Reagan and before. What it could not survive, in many of its specific applications, was contact with the operational realities of what the eliminated workers had actually been doing. The meat inspection example became, in the public conversation of that spring and summer, a kind of synecdoche for the larger problem. The Food Safety and Inspection Service, whose employees were responsible for the federal inspection of meat and poultry processing facilities, a function established by the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906, itself a response to precisely the kind of industry self-regulation that the market's admirers had argued was sufficient, lost a significant portion of its workforce through a combination of buyouts and terminations. The immediate operational consequence was not theoretical. Processing facilities that required continuous federal inspection presence to operate legally faced the prospect of suspension. Industry groups that had never been allies of federal regulatory expansion found themselves lobbying the administration with some urgency to restore the inspectors whose presence was legally required for their businesses to function. The episode was repeated, with variations, across multiple regulatory domains, and each iteration added to a growing empirical record suggesting that the federal workforce, whatever its inefficiencies, was not composed primarily of workers who could be removed without consequence to the functions their removal was supposed merely to streamline. The revealing action, the moment that served as the truest keyhole into what the enterprise actually was, had come earlier in those first frenzied weeks when DOGE published on its website what it described as a real-time accounting of the savings its cuts had generated. The figures were large and grew daily, updated with the ticker-like immediacy of a financial instrument, designed to communicate the kinetic excitement of a campaign that was measurably, visibly, numerically succeeding at its stated objective. Independent analysts from the Congressional Budget Office, from university economics departments, from nonpartisan budget research organizations that had spent decades developing the methodological tools for assessing government spending claims, examined the figures and found them, in their construction, to be something between creative accounting and fabrication. Savings attributed to canceled contracts included contracts that had already expired or that had been for one-time expenditures that would not recur regardless of DOGE's intervention. Savings attributed to workforce reductions failed to account for the legal costs of the litigation the reductions had generated, for the operational costs of the disruption to agency functions, for the buyout payments that had been required to achieve voluntary separations, for the cost of rehiring contractors to perform functions that dismissed employees had been performing at lower total cost. The true fiscal impact of DOGE's first phase of operations, when the accounting was done by people whose methodology was transparent and whose conclusions were therefore auditable, was substantially smaller than the headline figures claimed, and in some domains possibly negative. Musk's response to the analytical challenges was consistent with his response to all challenges to DOGE's narrative. He attacked the analysts, characterized the methodological critiques as politically motivated, and updated the ticker. Russell Vought, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, had arrived at his role with a conservative governance philosophy that was, in its intellectual architecture, more developed than anything DOGE had produced. Vought was a veteran of the first Trump administration, who had spent the intervening years developing, through a think tank called the Center for Renewing America, a comprehensive theory of executive power that provided the constitutional scaffolding for what DOGE was attempting to build. Where Musk brought velocity and the contempt for precedent that came with never having operated inside a governmental institution, Vought brought a lawyer's understanding of the statutory and constitutional levers that could be used to concentrate executive authority in ways that might survive judicial review. The relationship between the two men was, in the first months of the administration, a study in the complementarity of different kinds of aggression. Vought could tell Musk which cuts had legal cover and which were likely to be enjoined. Musk could generate the public and political pressure that made Vought's more measured institutional operations possible. They did not always agree on pace, and the people in rooms where both men had been present described a tension between Vought's preference for durability and Musk's preference for speed that never fully resolved into a coherent strategy. But they agreed on the objective, and the objective was a federal government permanently and structurally smaller than the one that had existed on January 19, 2025, and in the service of that objective, the disagreements about method were secondary. By autumn of 2025, the human geography of the cuts had begun to assert itself in ways that the efficiency argument had not anticipated, and that the administration had not prepared to address. Communities that had organized their economic lives around federal installations, the towns adjacent to Veterans Affairs facilities in rural states, the suburban corridors outside Washington where a generation of middle-class families had built their lives on the stability of federal employment, the research communities clustered around NIH campuses, and national laboratories whose funding structures had been disrupted by DOGE's contract cancellations, were experiencing contractions that showed up in local business revenues and school enrollment figures and housing prices, and the political representation of these communities included Republicans who had supported the DOGE agenda in the abstract and were now receiving, in their constituent emails and town hall meetings, a very concrete education in the difference between a theory of government and the lives of the people government employed. The polling began to shift, slowly but measurably, in the swing districts that determined the composition of the House of Representatives, and the members who represented those districts, whatever their stated commitment to the efficiency agenda, began to read those numbers with the attention that proximity to an election always sharpened. What none of the models fully accounted for, not the DOGE savings projections, not the union litigation strategies, not the political analysis of the administration's opponents, was the specific quality of Musk's indifference to the feedback that these consequences were generating. He had operated, at every stage of his career, on the conviction that disruption's costs were temporary and its benefits permanent, and that the people who suffered the costs were, however sympathetically one might view their individual circumstances, on the wrong side of an equation whose solution was not in doubt. He had held this conviction through the early Tesla production crises, through the Twitter layoffs, through the SpaceX failures that had killed hardware and careers, and briefly the company's prospects for survival. The conviction had, more often than not, been vindicated by subsequent events. The question that the autumn of 2025 was beginning to pose, quietly, in the data, in the courts, in the congressional offices where the political arithmetic was being recalculated, was whether the federal government of the United States, with its constitutional architecture, and its 330 million stakeholders and its 250-year accumulation of institutional inertia, was a different kind of system than the ones his conviction had previously overcome, and whether the answer to that question would arrive before or after the damage that the chainsaw had done became the kind that no subsequent efficiency could repair. Chapter 74. Spending Reality versus Optics, the $150 billion cut. The number appeared on the DOGE website in bold type, rendered with the clean confidence of a fact that had settled the argument before the argument had begun. $150 billion. It sat beneath a header that described it as savings delivered to the American taxpayer, updated with the rolling precision of an odometer, accompanied by an itemized ledger of contracts canceled, grants terminated, leases surrendered, and workforce reductions valued at the projected cost of salaries and benefits that would no longer be paid. The presentation had the aesthetic of a Silicon Valley product dashboard, real-time data forward, radiating the authority of transparency, and it had been designed with the deliberate intentionality that characterized everything DOGE produced for public consumption to communicate a specific and emotionally satisfying story, that the chainsaw had cut deep, that the waste had been found and eliminated, and that the man who had promised to slash the federal budget had delivered on the promise with a precision that his critics had declared impossible. In the White House briefing room, press secretaries cited the figure. On X, Musk pinned posts referencing it. In Republican congressional offices, members incorporated it into floor speeches and constituent newsletters. The number had achieved, through repetition and institutional endorsement, the status of established fact. It was not an established fact. The spring of 2025 existed within an information environment that had been under construction for years and that had reached, by the time DOGE's savings claims entered public circulation, a state of epistemological fracture severe enough that the dispute over what the federal government had actually saved was not, at its core, a dispute about accounting. It was a dispute about whose accounting counted, whose methodology was legitimate, whose conclusions deserved the authority of truth, and who had the institutional credibility to adjudicate the difference. This fracture had been Musk's political operating environment since the Twitter acquisition, and he had not merely adapted to it, but had actively deepened it, systematically undermining the institutional credibility of the organizations, mainstream media outlets, academic research centers, nonpartisan policy institutes, federal statistical agencies, whose function in the information ecosystem was precisely to provide the kind of independent verification that the DOGE savings figures required. He had spent 3 years characterizing fact-checkers as censors, journalists as propagandists, and economists whose conclusions differed from his own as ideological actors disguised as neutral analysts. The ground had been prepared with considerable thoroughness. When the challenges to the $150 billion figure arrived, they arrived into an environment where the challengers had already been discredited in the minds of the audience Musk most needed to hold. The challenges arrived nonetheless, and they were, in their technical dimensions, serious. The Congressional Budget Office, which had been established by Congress specifically to provide nonpartisan fiscal analysis independent of executive branch claims, examined the DOGE savings methodology and found it wanting in ways that were not marginal. The central problem was definitional. DOGE had counted as savings a category of expenditures that professional budget analysts did not recognize as savings in any technically defensible sense. Contracts that had been canceled, but whose underlying statutory obligations remained, meaning that the government would eventually need to procure the same services or goods through alternative vehicles, had been counted at their full face value rather than at the net present value of the actual fiscal change. Grants that had been terminated had in several cases generated legal obligations to grantees that would require settlement payments, the cost of which had not been subtracted from the gross savings figure. Positions that had been eliminated through buyouts had generated severance costs that the DOGE ledger recorded on a separate line, ensuring that the savings figure and the costs it had generated were never presented in proximity to each other. Workforce reductions that had been enjoined by federal courts, and were therefore not actually in effect, had nonetheless been counted as realized savings rather than projected ones. And across nearly every major category of claimed savings, independent analysts found examples of double counting, of the same contract appearing in multiple line items under different descriptions, inflating the aggregate figure in ways that the ledger's design made difficult to detect without careful cross-referencing. The Government Accountability Office, which had been auditing federal expenditures since 1921, and whose institutional independence from executive branch pressure had been tested across administrations of both parties, produced an assessment that was, by the measured standards of government audit language, unusually direct. It found that the DOGE savings claims could not be verified using the documentation that DOGE had provided, that the methodology underlying the figures was not consistent with generally accepted government accounting standards, and that the actual fiscal impact of DOGE's first phase of operations, adjusting for costs generated by the reductions for legal expenses, for the disruption to agency operations, and for the exclusion of non-recurring items that would not affect baseline spending, was substantially below the claimed figure. The GAO's best estimate, presented with the appropriate ranges and confidence intervals of an institution that understood the political sensitivity of what it was releasing, suggested that the genuine savings attributable to DOGE's operations might be between $18 and $35 billion, a range that was, by the standards of domestic discretionary spending cuts, historically significant, and that in almost any other political context would have been presented as a meaningful achievement. It was not $150 billion. It was not close to $150 billion. Musk's response had the form of a counter-argument and the substance of an attack. He posted within hours of the Gao report's release that the agency was itself a manifestation of the problem DOGE existed to solve, a legacy institution staffed by the same class of permanent bureaucrats whose interests were directly threatened by the efficiency agenda, and whose methodology had been designed to protect the status quo rather than to accurately account for the government's waste. He noted that the Gao's own budget had not been subject to DOGE review, and suggested, with the implication that served as a form of threat in his rhetorical arsenal, that it might benefit from one. He amplified posts from allies who characterized the report as partisan. He questioned the professional credentials of the analysts whose names appeared in the document's footnotes. And he reposted the $150 billion figure, without amendment or qualification, as though the report had not been released. The DOGE website's counter did not change. The keyhole into his character in this chapter was not the number itself, nor even his defense of it, but a specific exchange that took place in a Senate hearing room in April of 2025 when Musk appeared voluntarily, and with the theatrical confidence of a man who had decided that the congressional hearing was a format he could bend to his purposes, before a committee examining DOGE's operations. Senator after senator from both parties asked variations of the same question. Could Musk produce documentation supporting the $150 billion figure that would satisfy the accounting standards the Gao had applied? His answers were expansive, technically fluent in places, and almost entirely non-responsive to the specific question. He cited examples of individual contracts that had been canceled. He described the operational culture of agencies he characterized as resistant to accountability. He questioned the premises embedded in the senator's questions, observing that the accounting standards they were invoking had themselves been developed by the institutions DOGE was investigating, a circular dependency he found disqualifying. He was, in the hearing room, what he had always been in adversarial settings, quick, contemptuous of the format, and operating on the theory that the performance of the exchange mattered more than its content. What he did not do, across nearly 4 hours of testimony, was produce documentation. When a senator from a Midwestern state, a Republican who had supported the DOGE agenda, and whose support Musk could not afford to dismiss as partisan opposition, asked him directly whether he could guarantee that the $150 billion figure was accurate by any standard that an independent auditor would recognize, Musk paused for a moment that was, in context, slightly longer than his pauses usually were. Then he said that the number was his best current estimate, and that it would be refined as the work continued. It was the closest he had come, in any public setting, to acknowledging that the figure was something other than a fact. Sharon Parrott, the president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, had spent her career doing the kind of careful, unglamorous fiscal analysis that produced conclusions with narrow margins of uncertainty and broad in popularity among people who preferred their budget numbers to confirm what they already believed. She was not a figure in Musk's world, not connected to the technology ecosystem, not active on X in any meaningful way, not the kind of analyst whose work reached the audiences that Musk's platform had cultivated. But her organization's line-by-line examination of the DOGE savings claims, published in a format that made the methodology fully transparent and the conclusion fully reproducible by anyone willing to do the arithmetic, had become the document that serious budget analysts on both sides of the aisle were citing when they needed to explain with precision why the $150 billion figure did not hold up. Parrott had appeared on the kind of public radio and congressional testimony circuit that reached a different audience than X, smaller in number, more institutionally connected, and including critically the staff economists and budget directors whose analysis shaped the way that Republican appropriators thought about the administration's fiscal claims. She had not attacked Musk personally. She had simply shown the arithmetic. In the specific geography of Washington policy influence, this was in its own way more dangerous than any frontal assault. The structural reality that the savings dispute obscured, and that both sides of the argument had reasons not to foreground, was the one that any honest accounting of the federal budget made immediately apparent. The federal government's spending was not primarily composed of the discretionary expenditures that DOGE's cuts had targeted. It was composed in the overwhelming majority of mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans' benefits, interest on the national debt, programs whose expenditure levels were set by statute and formula rather than by annual appropriation, and which therefore could not be reduced by canceling contracts or eliminating agency workforces. In fiscal year 2024, mandatory spending had accounted for roughly 73% of total federal outlays. Defense discretionary spending accounted for approximately 13%. The entire domain of non-defense discretionary spending, the agencies, the grants, the contracts, the workforce that DOGE had spent 10 months cutting, represented something in the range of 14 cents of every federal dollar. Eliminating it entirely, down to zero, would not balance a budget that was running annual deficits exceeding $2 trillion. The $150 billion in claimed savings, even accepting the figure at face value, represented approximately 7% of the annual deficit. The chainsaw had been applied, with considerable noise and genuine human cost, to a portion of the building's exterior, while the structural load-bearing elements remained entirely untouched. Musk knew this. He was not a man who failed to understand arithmetic, and the arithmetic of the federal budget was not complicated enough to escape someone who had built rocket companies and managed manufacturing operations whose financial complexity dwarfed anything the federal government's discretionary budget contained. The question that his conduct throughout the savings dispute raised, and that the people around him, including the more institutionally experienced figures in the administration who had observed his approach closely, were beginning to ask with increasing candor in private, was whether the $150 billion figure had ever been intended primarily as an accurate fiscal accounting, or whether it had been intended primarily as a political object, a number large enough to sustain the narrative of the DOGE mission, to keep the base energized, to give Republican legislators something to point to, and to maintain the public pressure that made the enterprise politically viable, even as its legal and empirical foundations were being systematically challenged. The distinction mattered enormously, because if the number was political rather than fiscal in its primary function, then the accumulating fact checks and GAO reports and Senate hearings were not correctives to a mistake. They were challenges to a strategy, and strategies are not abandoned because they are shown to be inaccurate. They are abandoned when they stop working. The number was still on the website. The counter was still running. And in the Treasury Department, and the Office of Management and Budget, and the agencies that had absorbed the cuts, and were now managing the operational consequences, career officials who had spent their professional lives thinking about what the federal government actually cost and what it actually did were preparing the assessments that would eventually constitute the historical record of what had been accomplished and what had been lost. Assessments that would take years to complete, that would be disputed long after the political moment had passed, and that would ultimately answer, with the patience that only institutional memory can sustain, whether the most aggressively marketed fiscal campaign in the history of the American executive branch had saved the republic money, or had merely performed the saving of it, at a cost that the performance itself had made impossible to calculate cleanly. Chapter 75. The conflict with Trump and the administration exit. The Post went up at 11:47 in the evening, which was, for anyone who had spent time studying the rhythms of Elon Musk's public communications, a meaningful data point. The late-night posts were different from the daytime ones, less performative, less calibrated to the news cycle, carrying the specific quality of things said when the internal editor that daylight and consequence impose had loosened its grip. This one was directed at the legislation that Donald Trump had chosen to call the One Big Beautiful Bill, a sweeping reconciliation package that the House Republican leadership had spent months assembling from the competing demands of the party's fiscal conservatives and its populist wing, and that the White House had designated as the defining legislative achievement of the administration's first year. Musk called it a disgusting abomination. He did not hedge. He did not frame the criticism as constructive concern from a loyal ally. He used the language of contempt, the same language he applied to his enemies, and he applied it to the signature domestic legislation of the President of the United States, the man who had given him the authority to run the Department of Government Efficiency, the man whose election he had funded to the tune of $250 million, the man on whose stage he had bounced with unconcealed joy on the night of November 5th. In the West Wing, aides who had been managing the relationship between Trump and his most prominent outside supporter watched the post appear on their phones and understood, with the clarity that political professionals develop for these moments, that something had broken that would not be repaired by a phone call. The breaking had not been sudden. It had been accumulating since February. The political environment of spring 2025 was one in which the coalition that had elected Trump was beginning to experience the specific tensions that governing coalitions always experience when the abstractions of a campaign are required to resolve themselves into the concrete choices of a budget. The Republican Party that had won in November contained multitudes that the shared project of defeating Democrats had temporarily unified. Fiscal hawks who genuinely believed in deficit reduction and whose support for DOGE had been predicated on the expectation that it would produce structural spending cuts. Populists whose voters depended on Medicaid and farm subsidies and veterans' benefits, and who had supported the efficiency agenda on the understanding that the chainsaw would not reach programs their constituents used. Defense hawks who wanted military spending increased regardless of what happened to the civilian budget. And the Trump loyalists, the core of the coalition, whose primary commitment was to the president himself, and who would support or oppose specific policies as the president's position on those policies evolved. The One Big Beautiful Bill was the legislative instrument through which these tensions were being negotiated, and its contents, which included significant extensions of the 2017 tax cuts, structural changes to Medicaid that would reduce benefits for millions of current recipients, and spending levels that the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimated would add trillions to the national debt over the subsequent decade, represented a set of choices that could not satisfy all the factions simultaneously. Musk's objection was not the objection of a man discovering late that the bill's fiscal consequences were inconsistent with the deficit reduction he had spent 5 months claiming to pursue. His objection was more specific and more revealing. The bill's tax provisions would, in the assessment of analysts who examined it carefully, deliver significant benefits to the wealthiest Americans, including benefits that would accrue to people in Musk's own economic stratum. This was not in itself his complaint. His complaint was that the bill also extended and expanded certain subsidy structures that he characterized as corporate welfare, and that its overall fiscal trajectory contradicted, in the most publicly documented way possible, the stated rationale for everything DOGE had done. He had spent 5 months arguing that the federal government was spending money it did not have on programs it did not need, and that the moral urgency of this situation justified extraordinary measures, the workforce cuts, the contract cancellations, the disruption of agency operations, the human cost absorbed by the hundreds of thousands of federal employees whose careers had been ended in the service of fiscal responsibility. And now the administration, whose efficiency agenda he had led, was preparing to sign legislation that would, by any honest accounting, generate more new debt than DOGE had claimed to save. The arithmetic was not complicated. It was, however, politically combustible, and Musk, who had never developed the reflex that experienced politicians develop for the combustibility of arithmetic, said so out loud. Trump's response took several days to fully materialize, which was itself a form of communication. In the immediate hours following the late-night post, White House officials issued statements that were studiously temperate, noting the president's respect for Musk's contributions to the efficiency agenda while making clear that reasonable people could disagree about legislative priorities. This was the language of managed distance, the vocabulary of an administration beginning the process of creating daylight between itself and an ally who had become a liability. Trump himself, whose own posting habits were as revealing as Musk's, waited before engaging directly, and when he did engage, the response had the specific quality of a counterattack designed to remind its target of the asymmetry in their relationship. Trump noted on his own platform that Musk had received more government contracts through his companies than perhaps any businessman in American history, and that a man in that position might want to think carefully before lecturing the President of the United States about fiscal responsibility. The message was not subtle. It was a reminder that the federal government was a customer of SpaceX, a regulator of Tesla, a potential adversary of X, and that the President of the United States, whatever the informal terms of their arrangement had been, retained the authority to make all of those relationships more or less comfortable. The core conflict that the rupture exposed was one that had been visible to careful observers from the beginning of the DOGE enterprise: the fundamental incompatibility between Musk's operating assumptions and the actual logic of political power. Musk had approached the administration the way he approached every organizational relationship, as a meritocratic structure in which value delivered was the currency of standing, in which the person generating the most consequential output was entitled to the most authority, and in which loyalty was a function of aligned interest rather than personal hierarchy. Trump's operating assumptions were different in almost every dimension. For Trump, loyalty was primary, personal, and non-negotiable. It ran upward toward him, and it was demonstrated through deference and public solidarity, not through the delivery of efficiency metrics. The relationship between them had worked through the campaign and the early months of the administration, because their interests had aligned sufficiently that the difference in their underlying assumptions had not been forced into the open. The one big beautiful bill forced it into the open. Musk had treated Trump's legislative priority as an object of analysis, evaluated it against a standard of fiscal consistency that he applied publicly, and found it wanting. Trump had experienced this as disloyalty. In Trump's framework it was. The revealing action came not in the bill dispute itself, but in a sequence that preceded it by several weeks, and that, in retrospect, had been the first clear signal that the relationship's foundations were less stable than either party's public conduct suggested. In late April, Musk had used X to wade into a Republican primary race in a manner that created direct political complications for the White House. He had endorsed and amplified with the full weight of his platform's algorithmic infrastructure a candidate whose positioning on certain issues put them in implicit tension with an administration priority. The intervention had not been coordinated with the White House political operation. It had not been preceded by a conversation with the chief of staff or the political director or anyone whose function was to manage the relationship between the president's agenda and the activities of his allies. It had happened because Musk had seen something on his platform, formed a view, and acted on it, which was how he operated in every domain, and which was entirely incompatible with the discipline that political coalition management required. The White House had absorbed the episode without public comment, which was the appropriate response to an incident too small to justify the attention that a public response would generate. But the internal conversations that followed, in the offices of senior advisors who had experience managing relationships with powerful outside actors, and who understood that the pattern an incident revealed was more important than the incident itself, had produced a reassessment of the Musk relationship that would shape how the administration responded when the larger break arrived. Jared Kushner had been present at the edges of the DOGE project from its early conception, not as an operational participant, but as someone whose relationship with Trump spanned the full arc of the political relationship that had brought Musk into the administration's orbit, and whose read of the president's emotional weather was more reliable than almost anyone else's. Kushner had watched the Musk relationship develop with the specific attention of a man who had seen many people arrive in Trump's orbit, convinced that their value to him would insulate them from the dynamics that had consumed every other significant relationship in his political life. He had, by several accounts, offered observations, privately, in the careful manner that his position relative to the president required, that the DOGE arrangement contained structural tensions that would eventually surface, and that the timing and terms of Musk's eventual departure from formal involvement would matter enormously for what followed. Whether those observations had influenced the administration's management of the rupture when it arrived was not a question that could be answered from the public record. What was visible was that when Trump moved to create distance from Musk in the weeks following the bill dispute, the operation was conducted with more strategic coherence than most of the administration's communications suggested it was capable of, in a manner that positioned the departure as a natural and planned transition rather than an expulsion, that preserved enough of the formal relationship to prevent the break from becoming a public war, and that left Musk with sufficient face to refrain from burning the administration down with the platform he still controlled. Musk announced his departure from DOGE on May 30, 2025, in a post that was, by the standards of his communication style, almost restrained. He said that the initial work of the efficiency project had been completed, that he was returning to his primary business responsibilities, and that he would continue to support the administration's broader agenda as an outside voice. There was no acknowledgement of the preceding week's conflict. There was no admission that the departure was anything other than what it was officially described as being. And there was, notably, no expression of gratitude toward Trump of the kind that his initial endorsement post had contained, no flourish of personal loyalty, no warm invocation of their shared project. It was the post of a man executing a managed exit with the minimum viable performance of cordiality, preserving enough of the relationship to prevent immediate escalation while making no investment in its continuation. Trump's response was similarly calibrated, a brief acknowledgement of Musk's service that was complimentary in its language and empty in its affect, the kind of statement that official relationships produce when the human relationship has already concluded. What Musk returned to, on the morning of June 1, 2025, was a portfolio of companies that had been managed in his absence with varying degrees of the turbulence that his management style, even when exercised remotely and intermittently, tended to generate. Tesla's stock had declined significantly from its post-election peak, as investors who had initially read his proximity to the administration as a regulatory advantage had revised their assessment in light of the reputational complications that DOGE had produced with the portion of Tesla's customer base that did not share Musk's political trajectory. SpaceX, whose operational cadence was less subject to consumer sentiment than Tesla's, had continued its launch schedule with the institutional discipline that Gwynne Shotwell's management had always provided, though the NASA relationship had acquired new complexity from Musk's governmental role. X had continued to operate as Musk's primary political instrument even during the DOGE period, its editorial direction unchanged, its owner's posting volume undiminished by the additional responsibility of running a government efficiency operation. And XAI, the artificial intelligence company that he had founded in 2023 with the explicit ambition of building a competitor to the systems that OpenAI and Google and Anthropic were developing, had been advancing through a phase of rapid infrastructure expansion, building the supercomputing cluster in Memphis that would power the next generation of its Grok model, with the kind of resource commitment that signaled Musk's belief that the AI race was the most consequential technological competition of the era, the one whose outcome would determine more about the human future than any other. He had spent 5 months attempting to remake the American federal government, had claimed $150 billion in savings that independent auditors could not verify, had overseen the elimination of more than 250,000 federal jobs, had broken with the president he had helped elect over a bill that exposed the contradiction between the efficiency agenda's stated principles and its political realities, and had departed with the careful minimalism of a man who understood that the story was not finished, that the government he had disrupted was still operating, that the legal challenges to his actions were still proceeding through courts that moved on their own schedule, and that the businesses he was returning to were navigating markets that his political adventure had complicated in ways that the full accounting of would take years to complete. Years during which the question of what exactly Elon Musk had done to the American government and what it would do in response remained genuinely and consequentially open, its answer dependent on institutions whose patience was longer than his attention, and whose memory, unlike the memory of a news cycle, did not fade. Chapter 76. The $1 trillion pay package, reapproval. The proxy statement ran to several hundred pages, as proxy statements for large public companies tend to do, and buried within its financial disclosures and governance attestations and risk factor enumerations was a number that required a specific kind of cognitive adjustment to process, not because it was obscure or technically complex, but because it was so large that the mind's ordinary mechanisms for evaluating numerical magnitude simply declined to engage with it in the normal way. The compensation package that Tesla's board was asking shareholders to reapprove for Elon Musk was structured around stock options whose potential value, if Tesla's market capitalization reached the thresholds the package specified, would approach $1 trillion. The word trillion had entered the public vocabulary of American finance gradually over the preceding 2 decades, first in the context of national debt, then in the context of technology company valuations, then in the context of federal stimulus packages. and each entry had done something to its psychological weight, had made it slightly more available as a unit of ordinary reckoning. But $1 trillion as personal compensation remained, even in the inflated vocabulary of the technology age, a figure that occupied a category by itself. It was more than the annual GDP of all but a handful of nations. It was more than the market capitalization of most of the world's largest companies. It was, in the most literal sense available, an unprecedented amount of money for one person to receive from one company. And the question of whether it was appropriate, legally, ethically, practically, was a question that the Delaware Court of Chancery had already answered once in the negative, and that Tesla's shareholders were now being asked to answer again in a different jurisdiction, under circumstances that the company's legal team had spent the better part of 2 years engineering to produce a different result. Musk, returning from the wreckage and complexity of the DOGE period, needed a win that was unambiguous. The context of late 2025 was defined for him by a particular kind of institutional fatigue, not his own, which his physiology and psychology seemed congenitally resistant to producing, but the fatigue of the systems and relationships that had been strained by the preceding year's political adventure. Tesla's stock had traced a volatile and ultimately disappointing arc through the DOGE period. The post-election surge, which had carried the company's market capitalization back toward the heights of its 2021 peak, on the theory that Musk's proximity to power would translate into regulatory advantage, had reversed sharply as the reputational complications of the DOGE enterprise accumulated. Sales data from Europe had shown meaningful declines correlated with consumer boycott activity in markets where Musk's political positions were deeply unpopular: Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, the United Kingdom. In the United States, registration data suggested that the Tesla brand had undergone a polarization that tracked the broader political polarization of the Musk persona. Stronger in markets dominated by his political supporters, weaker in markets where his political trajectory had alienated the affluent, environmentally motivated buyers who had constituted Tesla's original customer base. The company that had once occupied the rare commercial territory of a brand admired across political lines, the Apple of automobiles, a luxury object that signified sophistication and environmental consciousness simultaneously, had become, in the span of roughly 18 months, a political object, its purchase a statement of affiliation that a significant portion of its former market was unwilling to make. Against this backdrop, the compensation vote carried a significance that extended well beyond its financial dimensions. It was a referendum on Musk's leadership of the company, on the board's judgment in proposing the package, on the institutional investors whose positions in Tesla were large enough to determine the outcome, and on the Delaware court's authority to void what shareholders had previously approved. The original package had been granted in 2018 and ratified by shareholders at that time, had been structured around a set of market capitalization and operational milestones that most analysts had considered essentially unreachable when the package was designed, and had been challenged in Delaware Chancery Court by a shareholder who argued that the process through which it had been approved was fatally compromised by the board's lack of independence from Musk. Chancellor Kathleen McCormick, the same judge who had overseen the Twitter acquisition litigation with such visible impatience for Musk's contractual escape attempts, had voided the package in January of 2024, finding that the board had failed to negotiate with the adversarial independence that its fiduciary obligations required, and that the shareholder vote approving the original package had been conducted on the basis of disclosures that were materially incomplete. Tesla had responded by reincorporating in Texas, convening a new shareholder vote, and asking its investors to ratify the package again, this time with fuller disclosures, in a jurisdiction whose corporate law was, by design and by legislative intent, more favorable to management than Delaware's. The core legal and governance conflict was a precise expression of the tension between two theories of corporate legitimacy that had been contested in American business law for decades. The Delaware court's approach embodied the view that shareholder democracy required genuinely independent board oversight, that a vote was only as valid as the process that produced it, and that a process contaminated by the board's failure to negotiate at arm's length from the CEO could not be rehabilitated simply by repeating it with additional paperwork. Tesla's counter-approach embodied the view that shareholders were the ultimate sovereigns of the corporation, that their informed vote on a compensation package represented the highest available form of democratic authorization, and that a court's substitution of its own judgment for theirs was the true governance failure. Both positions had serious legal and philosophical support, and the litigation that would eventually resolve which position governed, winding through Texas courts and potentially back to Delaware for ancillary issues, would take years to conclude. The shareholder vote was not the end of the legal story. It was a chapter in it, specifically the chapter that Musk needed to be written in his favor before the legal narrative reached its conclusion. The institutional shareholders, who held the largest positions in Tesla, the index funds and asset managers whose votes would determine the outcome, approached the second vote in a political environment that had complicated their calculation in ways that the first vote had not presented. The major proxy advisory firms, whose recommendations carried significant weight with institutional investors, had split in their guidance. One major firm recommended against approval on governance grounds essentially identical to those the Delaware court had cited, while another recommended in favor on the grounds that the package's milestone structure was sufficiently demanding to align Musk's incentives with shareholder value. The large passive index funds, whose voting policies had come under scrutiny from the Trump administration and from Republican politicians who characterized their environmental and governance voting patterns as ideological overreach, were navigating their own institutional pressures. Some had retreated from the more aggressive governance positions they had maintained in the preceding years, calibrating their public commitments to proxy voting under a political environment that was less hospitable to the apparatus of ESG investing than any administration in recent memory. Whether this political context influenced their Tesla votes was a question that the fund's public statements were carefully designed to make unanswerable. But the arithmetic of the outcome suggested that institutional support for the package had shifted meaningfully in Musk's favor relative to the original 2018 vote's margins. The revealing action came before the vote, in a letter that Musk sent, published on X as all his most important communications now were, to Tesla's institutional shareholders in the weeks preceding the annual meeting. The letter was, by the standards of CEO investor communications, remarkable in its tone. It did not make the case for the compensation package in the deferential language that proxy season convention required. The careful acknowledgement of shareholder concerns, the commitment to continued dialogue, the expression of gratitude for investors' confidence. It made the case in the language of ultimatum. Musk wrote that he was uncomfortable building Tesla's next generation of products, specifically its artificial intelligence and robotics initiatives, which he described as the company's most important future revenue sources, without having a meaningful ownership stake in the company, a stake that the compensation package would provide. He noted that he had previously said he wanted approximately 25% ownership of Tesla to feel comfortable committing his primary energy to it. He did not say explicitly what would happen if shareholders rejected the package, but the implication, hanging in the air of the letter with the specific gravity of a consequence too large to name directly, was that his attention and his ambitions might find a different home. It was, in the precise vocabulary of negotiating leverage, a threat, unconventional in its directness, unprecedented in its scale, and delivered without the apologetic framing that softens such communications into something a board's governance council might approve. Shareholders who voted against the package were being told, as clearly as language permitted without explicit statement, that they were voting against Musk's continued commitment to Tesla. The question of whether that commitment was the company's most valuable asset, or whether the conflation of his personal interests with the company's welfare was itself the governance problem the Delaware court had identified, was left for each shareholder to resolve according to their own theory of what Tesla was and who it belonged to. Robin Denholm, Tesla's board chair, had navigated the compensation controversy with the stoic endurance of someone whose professional identity had been tested, repeatedly and publicly, by the requirement of defending decisions whose defensibility was a matter of genuine dispute. An Australian technology executive who had joined Tesla's board in 2014 and assumed the chairship after the SEC had required Musk to relinquish it as part of the settlement over his infamous funding-secured tweet, Denholm had spent years occupying the paradoxical position of a board chair whose authority was real in formal terms and circumscribed in practical ones, someone who was responsible in the legal and fiduciary sense for the governance of a company whose most consequential decisions were made by a CEO, whose relationship with conventional governance was, to put it charitably, individualistic. The compensation controversy had required her to defend, in multiple public forums, and under direct questioning from institutional investors whose concerns were legitimate and legally grounded, a process that a court had found deficient, and a package whose scale had no precedent in corporate history. She had done so with the consistency of someone whose commitment to the institutional role was strong enough to survive the discomfort of its content. And when the shareholder vote came back in Musk's favor, with a margin that exceeded what the company's most optimistic projections had suggested, her statement describing the outcome as a validation of Tesla's governance and a demonstration of shareholder confidence carried the particular relief of a person who has been defending a bridge that has held and who can now provisionally stop waiting for the sound of its collapse. The vote passed. The package survived, at least in the sense that shareholders had now twice authorized it, though the legal challenges in Delaware continued on parallel tracks, and the ultimate enforceability of the award remained subject to judicial resolution that had not yet been reached. For Musk, the outcome was precisely the validation that the preceding 18 months had denied him in so many other domains. The DOGE savings figures had not withstood independent scrutiny. The relationship with Trump had not withstood the pressure of actual governance. The Tesla brand had not withstood the polarization of its founder's public persona without meaningful commercial cost. But the shareholders of the company he had built from an idea into the most valuable automaker in the history of the world had looked at a compensation package of essentially unprecedented scale and said for the second time that he was worth it, that the bet on his continued engagement was the bet they wanted to make with their capital, that the alternative universe in which Musk's primary attention resided elsewhere was a universe in which Tesla was worth less than the universe in which it resided here. It was a vote of financial confidence expressed in the largest number that shareholder democracy had ever produced, and Musk received it with the specific satisfaction of a man who had asked the market to validate his own assessment of his value, and found that the market, at least in this instance, agreed. What the vote could not resolve, what no vote, however large its margin, and no compensation package, however historic its scale, was capable of settling, was the question that the preceding year had raised with a clarity that the validation of the shareholder meeting temporarily obscured. The Tesla that shareholders were compensating Musk to lead was a company whose competitive position had been materially complicated by its founder's political adventure, whose brand had been altered in ways that the departure from DOGE had not automatically reversed, and whose most important future bets on autonomous driving, on the Optimus humanoid robot, on the energy storage business that had been growing quietly in the shadow of the automotive division's louder controversies, remained genuine and consequential questions rather than settled answers. The package's milestones required Tesla to reach market capitalizations that implied a value creation far beyond what any prior analysis of the automotive industry had suggested was achievable, and the path to those milestones ran directly through the competitive challenges from Chinese manufacturers, through the regulatory environment for autonomous vehicles, and through the continued willingness of consumers in the markets that determined Tesla's growth trajectory to separate their opinion of the product from their opinion of the man. Separation that the events of 2024 and 2025 had made considerably more difficult to maintain, and whose difficulty, compounding quietly in the sales data of European dealerships and the brand perception surveys of American consumers, would shape the ground on which every future milestone would need to be reached, whether or not the courts eventually decided that the package authorizing the reaching of them was valid. Chapter 77. Neuralink Human Trials, The First Successes. The cursor moved. It was not a dramatic movement, no sudden leap across the screen, no trembling flourish of triumph. It drifted slowly, with the tentative quality of a man testing ice he was not certain would hold. But Noland Arbaugh, 29 years old, paralyzed from the shoulders down since a diving accident in 2016, was moving it with nothing but his mind. He lay in a reclined chair, a thin surgical scar concealed beneath his dark hair, electrodes no wider than a human follicle threaded into the motor cortex of his brain. On the laptop screen before him, a cursor responded to his intention. He had been practicing chess against a computer program, an activity his injury had made physically impossible for 8 years, and now, through sheer thought, he was playing again. He later told interviewers it felt surreally like using the Force. The room around him was quietly technical, staffed by people who had spent years engineering toward this singular moment, but Arbaugh did not look at them. He looked at the screen. He was somewhere else entirely. Elon Musk was not in that room when Noland Arbaugh first demonstrated what a chip in his brain could do. He was, in all likelihood, somewhere between a satellite launch and a congressional hearing, between a deposition and a post on X that would ignite another 48 hours of online controversy. This was the rhythm of his existence by early 2024, a man operating at such centrifugal velocity that individual victories, even ones as staggering as a human being restored to the act of chess through neural interface technology, registered as data points in a portfolio rather than pauses for wonder. His companies were not his children so much as his instruments, each one a different string on an instrument he played at volumes no one else could sustain. Yet Neuralink was different. Among all the ventures he had seeded and pressured and willed into existence through force of personality and financial leverage, Neuralink sat closest to something that might be described in Musk's private lexicon as sacred. The project had emerged from a specific fear, one he articulated with unusual consistency over years of interviews, that artificial intelligence, if left to develop without biological integration, would render human consciousness obsolete. The solution, as he saw it with the blunt elegance that characterized his approach to all existential problems, was to merge. To put the chip in the skull. To make the human mind competitive with the machine, by making it, in some partial and evolving sense, also a machine. Neuralink was not, at its root, a medical device company. It was a species preservation project, dressed in the regulatory clothes of a medical device company. The distinction mattered to him enormously, even as the FDA required him to prove first that it could help paralyzed people move a cursor. The regulatory path had been tortured. Musk had pushed Neuralink's leadership for years to accelerate timelines that the agency's cautious, methodical culture refused to honor. There had been internal tensions, departures of senior scientists, and a 2022 Reuters investigation alleging that animal testing protocols had been conducted with a recklessness that killed far more subjects than necessary, charges the company disputed with vigor but which lingered in the public atmosphere like smoke. The FDA had initially rejected Neuralink's application for human trials in 2022, citing unresolved safety concerns about the device's lithium battery, the potential for the implant's wires to migrate through brain tissue, and questions about the surgical removal process. It took another year of revisions, additional data, and sustained regulatory engagement before approval was granted in May 2023. Human trials began that same year. By January 2024, Arbaugh became the first patient to receive the implant under the PRIME study, precise robotically implanted brain-computer interface. And within weeks he was demonstrating capabilities that the scientific community had to visibly restrain itself from calling miraculous. The hurdle was not, at this moment, scientific. The science, against considerable odds, was working. The hurdle was credibility, or rather, the complicated atmospheric pressure that surrounded anything connected to Musk's name by the middle of 2024. The country was in the compressed, overheated tunnel of a presidential election year. Donald Trump and Joe Biden were lumbering toward a rematch that much of the country watched with the exhausted dread of a sequel no one had requested. The culture was sorting itself into armed informational camps, and Musk, who had spent 2022 and 2023 transforming Twitter into X, reinstating banned accounts, publicly attacking media institutions, and positioning himself as the champion of a particular strain of anti-establishment libertarianism, had become to roughly half the country a hero and to the other half a villain. Neither characterization left room for nuance. Neither left room for the possibility that a man with genuine authoritarian instincts and genuine genius might be doing, simultaneously, something that deserved uncomplicated celebration. Neuralink's Arbaugh announcement landed in this atmosphere. The initial coverage was extraordinary. The videos of a paralyzed young man playing chess and Mario Kart through thought alone broke through even the election's gravitational pull on the media cycle. But within days, the discourse had fractured predictably. Skeptics questioned the pace of the trials, the adequacy of informed consent procedures, and the concentration of transformative neurotechnology in the hands of a single billionaire who had already demonstrated, through his stewardship of X, a willingness to subordinate institutional norms to personal vision. Supporters argued that the FDA's traditional caution would have delayed this breakthrough by decades, and that Musk's impatience, maddening to regulators, was precisely the force that had dragged the timeline into the present. Musk, for his part, handled the moment with characteristic asymmetry. Publicly, he was restrained and almost clinical, posting data, amplifying Arbaugh's own testimony, letting the images do the rhetorical work that his more combative posts on X typically did with words. But in private communications, and in occasional unguarded moments during interviews, another register emerged. He described Neuralink's progress in terms that were not merely optimistic but cosmological. He spoke of addressing blindness, paralysis, depression, schizophrenia, and then, without apparent awareness of the tonal leap, he pivoted to the longer game, the bandwidth problem, the compression of human experience into digital signal, the eventual upload question. The near term and the eschatological lived in his mind as adjacent rooms, connected by a doorway he walked through without ceremony. It was in one of these moments, during a conversation with Arbaugh that was later made partially public, that the keyhole opened onto something essential about him. Arbaugh, who had processed his condition with a combination of dark humor and philosophical equanimity that made him a compelling spokesman for the technology, told Musk that the most unexpected benefit of the implant had not been chess or cursor control. It had been the recovery of a sense of agency, the feeling, lost for 8 years, that his intentions could produce consequences in the world. Musk listened to this, and was uncharacteristically quiet for a moment. Then he said something that people in the room remembered differently in the various accounts that circulated afterward, but whose essential content was this: that the purpose of the technology was to restore the loop between wanting and doing, and that the tragedy of the human condition, not just for the paralyzed but for everyone, was how often that loop was broken by circumstance, by biology, by the failures of the body to execute what the mind demanded. It was a rare moment of expressed empathy from a man more typically described in terms of his demands than his understanding, and it illuminated something that his critics frequently missed and his admirers frequently over-romanticized. Musk was not indifferent to human suffering. He was, in his way, consumed by it, but he processed suffering not as an emotional experience to be witnessed and shared, but as an engineering problem to be solved. The distinction made him, in practice, a more effective builder and a more difficult human being. The people who worked for him knew both versions intimately. Among those people, Matthew McDougall, Neuralink's head of neurosurgery, occupied a position of particular significance during this period. A Stanford-trained neurosurgeon with a background in epilepsy and deep brain stimulation, McDougall had been responsible for the implantation procedure that had placed the device in Arbaugh's skull. He was, in the clinical sense, the man whose hands had done the work that Musk's vision had described. Their relationship was not warm in the way that some of Musk's early collaborator relationships, with J.B. Straubel at Tesla, with Gwynne Shotwell at SpaceX, had carried an element of personal loyalty and mutual recognition. It was professional, productive, and shadowed by the same pressure gradient that characterized all of Musk's working relationships, the awareness that the timeline he wanted was always shorter than the timeline medicine required. McDougall had navigated this with the careful precision of someone who understood that institutional integrity was not an obstacle to the mission, but its precondition. He pushed back where necessary through channels, maintaining relationships with the FDA that Musk's public posture frequently complicated, ensuring that the human trial protocols met standards that would survive external scrutiny. He was, in a sense, the institutional immune system of a company whose founder had the antibodies of a man who had never stopped being allergic to institutions. Their dynamic, visionary impatience managed by clinical discipline was in microcosm the story of what made Neuralink simultaneously remarkable and precarious. By mid-2025, Neuralink had implanted devices in a small number of additional patients under expanded trial protocols. The results were not uniformly spectacular. One early patient experienced complications involving the retraction of electrode threads, reducing the device's functional channel count, but the trajectory was, by any reasonable measure, forward. Arbaugh remained the most visible patient, and his continued engagement with the technology, His willingness to discuss both its capabilities and its frustrations with a public frankness that the company had not scripted gave the enterprise a human face that its CEO's increasingly political profile made difficult to supply from the top. That political profile was, by mid-2024, no longer incidental to the Neuralink story. Musk had moved, with a decisiveness that surprised even people who knew him well, into explicit alignment with Donald Trump's presidential campaign. He contributed, through his America PAC, sums that dwarfed any previous involvement in electoral politics, and then went further, appearing at rallies, posting with open advocacy on X, and framing his support in terms that were not merely transactional but ideological. He spoke about the administrative state, the way he spoke about legacy automakers and the legacy space industry, as an entrenched apparatus of institutional inertia that was actively impeding the future. His diagnosis was consistent. His prescription was, as always, disruption. The victory, when it came in November 2024, was decisive. And in the weeks that followed, Musk's role in the incoming administration took shape around something that would have seemed, even a year earlier, like satire: a new advisory body called the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, with Musk at its head, tasked with identifying and eliminating federal waste with the same energy he had applied to rocket reusability and electric vehicle cost reduction. It was not a cabinet position. It carried no statutory authority. It was, in structural terms, a suggestion. But in the hands of a man who had built two of the most capital-intensive industries in the world from scratch, suggestions had a way of becoming infrastructure. What remained, watching all of this from the quiet distance of his reclined chair in whatever examination room Neuralink used for follow-up assessments, was Nolan Arbaugh, a young man who had received a gift of extraordinary and ambiguous power from a figure now operating at the intersection of private innovation and governmental authority in ways the country had no existing language to describe. The cursor still moved when Arbaugh thought about moving it. The chess games continued. And somewhere in the architecture of the device, nested in his motor cortex, in the data flowing from his intentions through 1,600 electrodes to a laptop screen, lay a question that no one at Neuralink had yet answered aloud: when the man who built the machine also helps run the government, who precisely owns the loop between wanting and doing? That question was already making its way toward a courtroom. Chapter 78. Starship, Achieving Orbital Reusability. The sound arrived before the light. It always did, at Boca Chica. The acoustic wave from a Raptor engine ignition sequence traveled across the scrubland and the brackish shallows of the Gulf like something geological, not a noise so much as a rearrangement of air pressure that you felt first in the sternum, then in the back teeth, then in the loose change in your pocket. On the morning of the fifth integrated flight test, in October 2024, Elon Musk stood in the launch control area and did what he always did in the final minutes before ignition. He went very still. The manic energy that animated his public performances, the improvisational tangents, the sudden laughs, the posts fired off at midnight, drained from him, and what remained was something harder and more concentrated: the face of a man doing arithmetic in a language no one else in the room could read. His engineers had seen this stillness before. Some of them found it reassuring. Others had learned over years of launches and explosions and near misses that his stillness was not calm. It was compression. 33 Raptor engines lit beneath the Super Heavy booster, and the sky over South Texas changed color. The Starship program had, by late 2024, accumulated a history that read less like an engineering timeline than like a myth of repeated destruction and resurrection. The first integrated flight test, in April 2023, had produced what the SpaceX communications team carefully called a rapid, unscheduled disassembly, an explosion so thorough that the launch pad itself was excavated by the force of 33 engines firing without adequate blast mitigation infrastructure, showering the surrounding area with pulverized concrete, and creating an environmental controversy that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pursued with the kind of institutional tenacity Musk had spent 20 years learning to navigate. The second test, in November 2023, had improved upon the first in every technical sense, and still ended in two separate explosions, one for the booster, one for the ship. The third, in March 2024, went farther. The fourth, in June, farther still, surviving re-entry in ways that made the heat shield engineers briefly euphoric before the data showed them what they still didn't understand. Each test was, in the peculiar vocabulary of SpaceX, a success. This was not spin. It was methodology. A genuine philosophical commitment to the idea that a vehicle that explodes while providing 16 minutes of new data is more valuable than a vehicle that never flies because it might explode. The approach was Musk's most durable innovation, more consequential in some ways than any specific technology his companies had produced: the industrialization of failure as a design tool. NASA had operated under a paradigm in which failure was institutional catastrophe, something to be prevented at such extreme cost that the prevention itself became the mission, the shuttle program its most cautionary monument. SpaceX had inverted this. Failure was the curriculum. The rocket was the student. You sent it up, watched it come apart, and read the wreckage like a text. This was, to the aerospace establishment, anywhere from disruptive to appalling, depending on where you sat. To the engineers who had grown up inside the old paradigm, there was something in the approach that violated a professional ethic, an attitude toward risk that felt at its edges like contempt. But to the generation SpaceX had recruited from universities and startups and the fringes of the industry, engineers for whom the shuttle era was already history rather than lived experience, the methodology felt like liberation. They moved faster. They broke things. They launched again. By 2024, Musk was not simply managing SpaceX. He was, simultaneously, managing a satellite internet constellation, serving millions of users across dozens of countries, running a social media platform in continuous political controversy, co-heading a governmental advisory body with an ambition that had Washington's permanent administrative class in states of varying alarm, and waging the most expensive and complex campaign in the history of brain-computer interfaces. The question of how a single human nervous system sustained this was one that journalists asked him with some regularity, and he answered it in the way that told you nothing. He slept less than he should, he worked more than was healthy, and he appeared to experience the volume of his obligations not as burden but as stimulation, as though the quantity of problems was itself a form of fuel. But Starship was different, in the way that Neuralink was different. Among his ventures, it was the one that carried the eschatological weight most openly. Mars was not, for Musk, a metaphor or a marketing strategy. It was a backup drive, a biological redundancy for a civilization he regarded as dangerously concentrated on a single fragile planet. Every test flight of Starship was, in his private accounting, a step toward a launch manifest that had nothing to do with commercial satellite deployment or NASA contracts, and everything to do with the first crewed missions to another world. He talked about this with a consistency that had initially read as eccentricity, and by 2024 read more like the fixed conviction of a man who had decided early what his life was for, and had never seriously revisited the question. The core conflict of the Starship program's 2024 chapter was not propulsive. The engines worked. The guidance systems improved with each flight. The thermal protection tiles, the great ceramic patchwork that covered the ship's belly and had shed so dramatically during the third and fourth tests, were beginning to hold. The conflict was regulatory and political, and it was embodied in an agency, the Federal Aviation Administration, that operated in a legal and institutional framework constructed for a different century's aviation. The FAA's licensing process for launch vehicles had not been designed to accommodate a company that treated each vehicle as an iterative prototype and intended to fly dozens of them per year. Every test required a new license or license modification. Every environmental review triggered by a new launch configuration created opportunities for litigation by organizations that had legitimate concerns about the ecological fragility of the Boca Chica coastline. The process was not corrupt. It was not, by its own lights, unreasonable. It was simply built for a pace that SpaceX had left behind. Musk's frustration with the FAA was genuine and long-standing, and it had curdled by 2024 into something that shaped his political trajectory in ways he acknowledged with unusual directness. He had watched, in real time, what felt to him like an administrative apparatus using legitimate process as a de facto veto over technological progress, and he had concluded that the apparatus itself, not specific rules, not specific administrators, but the structural DNA of regulatory bureaucracy, was the obstacle. This conclusion fit neatly into a worldview that was already forming around other perceived instances of institutional inertia: the legacy auto industry's resistance to electric vehicles, the traditional aerospace establishment's resistance to reusability, the media's resistance to what he characterized as unfiltered speech. The pattern, as he perceived it, was always the same: the incumbent structure protecting itself from the future. And the solution was always the same: go around it, or go through it, or go over it at a velocity that made obstruction impractical. It was in this context that the fifth integrated flight test on October 13, 2024, became something more than an engineering milestone. The Super Heavy booster, after separating from the Starship upper stage, executed a return burn and descended toward the launch tower with a precision that the team had spent months engineering, and that none of them, in the privacy of their own statistical reasoning, had expected to work on the first attempt. The tower's mechanical arms, what SpaceX had named, with the knowing whimsy the company cultivated as corporate personality, the chopsticks, reached out and caught the booster in midair. 71 meters of stainless steel, freshly returned from the edge of space, held between two arms of a launch tower like something fragile. The control room erupted in the way that control rooms do not normally erupt, without restraint, without the professional composure that aerospace culture demands in its sacred spaces. People wept. People who had worked on nothing but propellant flow calculations for 3 years and had never cried at work discovered that they were, in fact, capable of crying at work. Musk, watching from outside, pumped both fists in the air with an abandon that the cameras caught and that circulated across the internet within minutes. It was the gesture of a man who had imagined a specific thing for a very long time and had just watched it become real. Not a strategic display of enthusiasm for an audience, but the involuntary motor response of genuine disbelief resolving into genuine joy. He said afterward, in the post-flight press remarks, that the catch had a probability of success that the team had estimated somewhere around 50%. This was almost certainly an underestimate offered for rhetorical effect. SpaceX's engineers did not attempt maneuvers that they gave even odds of failure on the first try. But it captured something true about the emotional experience of watching it work, which was that it had felt like a coin flip until the moment the chopsticks closed, and then it felt, suddenly and retrospectively, inevitable. This is one of the particular qualities of transformative engineering. It makes the future seem obvious the moment it arrives. Gwynne Shotwell watched the catch from her own vantage point within the SpaceX organization, as she had watched every major milestone in the company's history, with a combination of pride, relief, and the particular vigilance of someone who understood that the moment of triumph was also the moment of maximum exposure to the next thing that could go wrong. Shotwell's relationship with Musk was, by 2024, one of the most consequential partnerships in the history of private enterprise, and it had survived things that most partnerships do not survive: public statements by her CEO that complicated her customer relationships, management philosophies that she sometimes had to translate into language that a normal organization could execute, and the constant pressure of being responsible for the operational reality of visions that were formulated without much attention to operational reality. She was, in the formulation that people who knew both of them used most often, the person who made it actually happen, the one who turned his physics intuitions into contracts, schedules, and launch manifests. In the months following the fifth flight test, as Starship moved through its sixth test and into the early phases of what the company described as a transition from development to operations, their dynamic shifted in a subtle but observable way. Musk's attention was increasingly bifurcated, pulled between Boca Chica and Washington with a force that was new to his portfolio. DOGE consumed hours. X consumed hours. The political adjacency to the incoming Trump administration generated a constant stream of public controversy that required management of a kind that had no analog in rocket engineering. Shotwell, without announcement or drama, absorbed more of the day-to-day operational gravity of the program. She had always run the business. Now, she was running more of the mission. This was not, to those watching closely, a sign of organizational weakness. It was, arguably, the sign of a company that had matured to the point where its most important asset was no longer the singular attention of its founder, but the institutional capability it had built around his vision. Starship was bigger than any one person's bandwidth. This was a new thing for SpaceX. It was not clear that Musk entirely welcomed it. The sixth integrated flight test, in November 2024, caught the booster again. The ship on this flight was recovered from the ocean in a controlled water landing rather than a chopstick catch, a sequencing decision based on test priorities rather than technical limitation. The data gathered from both flights accelerated the timeline for what SpaceX was calling the operational phase of Starship, the version of the vehicle that would carry NASA's Artemis astronauts to the lunar surface under the Human Landing System contract, the version that would eventually, in the manifests Musk kept in his head if not yet on paper, carry the first humans toward Mars. By early 2025, Starship had become something that it had not been a year earlier, a program that outsiders, not just enthusiasts, not just the ambient Musk-admiring culture of the tech industry, but serious aerospace professionals and national security analysts were beginning to treat as a near-term operational reality. The Chinese National Space Administration had, according to reporting, Musk tracked closely accelerated development of its own Super Heavy launch vehicle in direct response to Starship's demonstrated progress. The vehicle that had been described as a fantasy by the legacy aerospace community for the better part of a decade was now being treated as a geopolitical fact, a shift in the capability landscape that required a national response. Musk absorbed this with visible satisfaction. Competition, to him, was confirmation. If China was racing to catch up, the race was real. And if the race was real, then every FAA license delay, every environmental review, every procedural friction applied to Starship's development cadence was not merely an inconvenience but a strategic liability, ammunition for the argument he was already making in the halls and offices of the incoming administration, that the regulatory state's relationship to American technological ambition required fundamental reconstruction. He was making that argument now from a position no private citizen had occupied before, with a portfolio of leverage, economic, political, and informational, that would have seemed implausible even 5 years earlier, and the people who were beginning to think carefully about what that accumulation of leverage meant were not yet certain whether they were watching the birth of something extraordinary or the early chapters of something they would spend years trying to undo. Chapter 79. The XXAI Merger. Everything Everywhere All at Once. The term sheet ran to 47 pages. Musk did not read it the way lawyers read term sheets, sequentially with annotations in the margins, pausing to flag language that required negotiation. He read it the way he read engineering schematics, scanning for the load-bearing elements, the places where the structure would either hold or fail, ignoring the connective tissue of legal boilerplate the way an experienced pilot ignores routine instrument readings. He had been in the room, or on the call, or somewhere proximate to the deal mechanics for the better part of 3 months, and by the morning the final valuation was agreed upon, $113 billion for the combined entity, a number that required a specific kind of confidence to say aloud without flinching. He had the posture of a man who had already lived in the future version of this decision, and was now simply waiting for the present to catch up. His advisors around the table at various points during the process had grown accustomed to this quality in him, the sense that the deliberation was, in some meaningful way, theater, because he had already decided, and the only remaining variable was the sequence of steps required to make the outside world agree. He signed where indicated. X and XAI became one. To understand why this merger happened when it did, and in the form it took, requires understanding the particular atmospheric pressure of the first half of 2025, a period in which Musk occupied a position in American public life for which there was no reliable historical template. He was simultaneously the most prominent private citizen in the country and one of its most consequential unofficial public servants. DOGE was generating headlines daily, some celebrating the efficiency it claimed to have discovered in the federal bureaucracy, many more cataloging the disruption it was causing in agencies whose institutional memory was being treated as organizational fat rather than functional tissue. His ex-posts were, at this point, closer to state communications than personal expression, capable of moving financial markets and shaping news cycles with a consistency that the White House press office could only regard with a mixture of admiration and alarm. He was being sued in multiple jurisdictions. He was being celebrated in multiple countries. He was sleeping, by most available accounts, not nearly enough. Into this environment, the XXAI merger arrived not as a surprise, but as an inevitability that the technology industry had been modeling for months. The logic was visible in the architecture of both companies before the deal was announced. X, the platform, Musk had acquired for $44 billion in 2022, and stripped and rebuilt with the urgency of a man who believes the building is on fire, and the fire is the point, sat atop one of the largest repositories of real-time human communication in the world. Hundreds of millions of posts per day. Arguments, confessions, market signals, political sentiment, cultural eruptions, the full unfiltered velocity of what people actually thought when they thought they were only talking to each other. This was not merely social data. In the vocabulary of artificial intelligence development, it was something closer to a continuous, self-replenishing stream of training material, the kind of corpus that an AI company would spend years and billions of dollars trying to approximate through other means. XAI had been born in 2023 from Musk's conviction, held with an intensity that had already produced one lawsuit against OpenAI and Sam Altman, alleging a betrayal of the organization's founding nonprofit mission, that the major artificial intelligence laboratories were developing godlike systems with insufficient attention to safety, insufficient transparency, and an institutional culture that had become, in his reading, dangerously aligned with a specific ideological sensibility that he characterized as a threat to the diversity of thought that made civilization resilient. His response was to build a competing system, Grok, and to staff XAI with researchers recruited from DeepMind, Google Brain, and the broader landscape of AI talent with the checkbook aggression that had characterized every previous SpaceX and Tesla hiring campaign. Grok was integrated into X almost immediately, giving Zay's model a distribution channel that OpenAI's ChatGPT, despite its extraordinary user numbers, could not precisely replicate. A platform where the AI existed not as a destination users navigated to, but as a presence embedded in the stream of everything else they were already doing. The merger formalized what the integration had already implied. X's data would train Zay's models. Zay's models would animate X's product experience. The combined entity would be, in the technical sense, vertically integrated, controlling the data source, the training pipeline, the model architecture, and the distribution surface within a single corporate structure. This was not, in principle, different from what other technology conglomerates had assembled through years of acquisition and internal development. What was different was the speed and the specific combination of assets, and the fact that the man who controlled the combined entity also controlled the world's most used satellite internet network, its most ambitious space launch system, the world's highest volume electric vehicle manufacturer, an implantable neural interface company, and through his DOGE role, significant informal influence over the operations of the American federal government. The core conflict of the merger was not, as the financial press largely framed it, a question of valuation. The $113 billion figure attracted inevitable scrutiny. X had been valued at approximately $9.4 billion by Fidelity as recently as late 2023, a collapse from the $44 billion acquisition price that reflected the advertising exodus that had followed Musk's content moderation overhaul. The question of how a platform that had lost roughly 3/4 of its enterprise value in 2 years had become, in combination with a 2-year-old AI startup, a $113 billion asset, was one that analysts worked through with spreadsheets that required assumptions they were not entirely comfortable making in public. But Musk had never been interested in the financial press's valuations of his companies. He had watched Tesla be shorted into oblivion, and then watched it become the most valuable automaker in the world. He understood in his bones something that the valuation models struggled to capture, that the worth of a network is not static, and that the worth of a network combined with a learning system that improves on the network's data is not simply additive. The conflict that actually mattered, the one that kept his legal team occupied and his policy advisors worried, was antitrust. By mid-2025, the accumulation of Musk's holdings had begun to attract the kind of scrutiny that regulatory frameworks had not been built to process efficiently. The existing antitrust vocabulary had been developed to address monopolies within markets. A single company controlling too large a share of social media, or of cloud computing, or of electric vehicles. What Musk had assembled was something different, Dominance distributed across markets that were individually competitive, but that created in combination a concentration of strategic capacity that the existing frameworks had no clean language for. The FTC, operating under a leadership whose relationship with the Trump administration was its own complicated story, was watching. The European Commission was watching. Several state attorneys general were watching. They were watching in the way that regulators watch when they are not yet certain what they are seeing, but are quite certain they should be seeing it. The revealing moment, the keyhole through which the larger character of the decision could be read, came during an all-hands meeting with X and XAI employees in the weeks following the merger announcement, a session that was partially recorded and excerpts of which circulated among technology journalists. Musk was asked by an engineer. The specific question is reconstructed from multiple second-hand accounts, whether the combination of X's real-time data with Zay's training infrastructure raised concerns about privacy. The question was asked respectfully, technically, in the register of someone who worked in the field and understood what they were asking. Musk's answer ran for several minutes. He addressed the technical architecture of data anonymization. He discussed the difference between training on behavioral patterns and training on personal information. He made the comparison, which he had made in other contexts, between X's data usage and the data usage practices of companies that had spent years assuring users of privacy protections that were, under examination, more aspirational than operational. And then, with the pivot that people who knew him recognized as the moment where the argument shifted from defensive to expansive, he said something that cut past the technical question entirely. He said that the alternative to building AI systems on real-world human data was building them on synthetic data or curated data, and that systems built on curated data were, by definition, systems that reflected the biases of the curators. He said that what X represented, in its raw and contentious and frequently maddening totality, was the actual human mind in aggregate. Not the human mind as a content policy team would prefer it to be, but as it was. And he said that training an AI on that reality, rather than on a sanitized approximation of it, was the only way to build a system that could be genuinely useful rather than merely inoffensive. It was an argument that was simultaneously technically interesting, philosophically coherent, and almost entirely beside the point of the privacy question he had been asked. This was Musk, at his most characteristic, moving from a question he found limiting to a vision he found energizing, deploying genuine intellectual force in the service of an answer that happened also to justify what he had already decided to do. The engineer who had asked the question nodded carefully. The recording ended shortly after. Igor Babushkin, one of Zay's founding researchers, and a former DeepMind scientist whose technical reputation had been among the main signals that serious people were taking the new company seriously, occupied the role of key figure in this chapter's internal drama. Babushkin was not a public figure in the way that other characters in Musk's orbit had become. He did not cultivate press, did not appear at conferences with the networking aggression of the VC-adjacent AI researcher, and had not generated the kind of documented disagreements with his employer that tended to produce quotable memoir material. He was, by most accounts, exactly what his CV suggested: a researcher of exceptional capability who was genuinely interested in the hardest problems in machine learning, and who had concluded that XAI was the environment most likely to let him work on them. The merger changed his context in ways that were more cultural than organizational. XAI had been, in its founding period, a small and intensely focused research organization, the kind of environment that attracts a certain kind of scientist who values speed and intellectual freedom over institutional stability. X was something else entirely: a platform company with a user base, an advertising business in recovery, a content moderation philosophy that generated daily controversy, and a public profile that was, by any measure, the most politically charged of any technology company in the world. Integrating these two cultures, the research organization's preference for abstraction and the platform company's immersion in the concrete reality of millions of human interactions per hour, was the organizational challenge that the merger's press release did not describe and that its financial model did not price. Babushkin navigated this with the apparent equanimity of someone who had decided that the work was more important than the noise around the work. He and his team pushed forward on Grok's capability development with a cadence that, by mid-2025, had produced a model that industry benchmarks placed in genuine competition with the leading offerings from OpenAI and Anthropic, not superior across all dimensions, but competitive in ways that had not been true 18 months earlier, and improving at a rate that reflected the advantage of training on X's continuous data stream. The product was working. The question of whether the combined company could survive the legal and regulatory pressures accumulating around it was, explicitly, someone else's problem. The merger closed in the spring of 2025, and within weeks its consequences were visible in the product in ways that ordinary users could observe without reading a press release. Grok became more responsive, more contextually aware, better at understanding the tonality and subtext of current events because it was, in the most literal sense, being trained on current events as they happened. The latency between the world changing and the AI knowing about the change compressed towards something approaching real time. This was the thing Musk had been describing in various forms for the 2 years since Zay's founding, a system that did not merely know the past but was continuously updated by the present. It was also, as several researchers outside the company pointed out with increasing urgency, a system whose training dynamics were, by virtue of their novelty, not well understood. A feedback loop between a platform and a model in which the model's outputs influenced user behavior on the platform whose data then influenced the model's training. A recursive relationship whose long-term properties no one had yet characterized. The engineers at XAI were aware of this. They discussed it in internal channels with the seriousness that the question deserved. They were building something they did not entirely understand, which was, in the history of Musk's enterprises, neither unusual nor, by his lights, disqualifying. You built the rocket and you launched it, and you learned from the explosion. What no one in those internal channels had yet calculated was what happened when the explosion was not in hardware, but in the information environment of a democratic society, and whether there existed, for that category of failure, any equivalent of a chopstick catch. Chapter 80. Family Expansion, Children 10 through 13. The nursery, if you could call it that, was not a room so much as a logistical arrangement. There were staff, of course, there were always staff, the quiet infrastructure of nannies and security personnel and household managers, that wealth at Musk's scale made not a luxury but an operational necessity, the same way SpaceX required launch controllers rather than a single engineer with a very long arm. But the child was there too. Small and new in the way that all children are small and new, indifferent to valuation multiples and Senate hearings and the question of whether DOGE had the legal authority to access the Treasury Department's payment systems. Musk held the infant with the particular posture of a man who has held many infants. Not the stiff uncertainty of a first-time father, but the practiced, slightly distracted ease of someone for whom this was familiar territory. The body knowing what to do while the mind was somewhere else entirely, probably in low Earth orbit, probably calculating burn trajectories. A visitor who observed him in these moments described something almost paradoxical, that he was most visibly human, most recognizably a person rather than a phenomenon in rooms like this one, and that he seemed in these rooms most acutely alone. By the end of 2025, the confirmed count of his children had reached 13. The number required a moment of consideration, even for people who had been paying close attention. 13. Spread across multiple mothers, across a timeline that ran from his first marriage to Justine Wilson in the early 2000s, and the devastating loss of their firstborn son Nevada, who died of sudden infant death syndrome at 10 weeks. A grief that Musk processed with the emotional compression that characterized his relationship to all personal pain, speaking of it rarely and then with a flatness that people around him read as either profound compartmentalization or something they lacked the vocabulary to describe. Through his relationships with Tallulah Riley, with Amber Heard briefly and controversially, with the musician Claire Boucher known as Grimes, with Siobhan Zalis, a senior executive at Neuralink, and with others whose identities were either confirmed through legal filings and reporting or remained by design or circumstance less fully documented in the public record. The names of his children constituted their own particular cultural artifact. The 5 boys from his first marriage, Griffin, Vivian, Damien, Saxon, and Kai, though Vivian had legally changed both her name and gender in 2022, renouncing her father's surname in a court filing that was, among all the public challenges Musk had faced, perhaps the most personally pointed, a child's legal declaration delivered through the machinery of the state he was simultaneously attempting to reform, that she did not wish to be associated with him in any identifying way. Then XAA12 called X, born to Grimes in 2020, and joined by a daughter X, a dark sidereal called Y in 2021. Then Strider and Azure, born to Zalise in 2021 via IVF, a circumstance that became public through a court records search in 2022, and which Musk confirmed with characteristic directness, offering context about the world's need for more people and his personal commitment to addressing what he regarded as the civilizational crisis of declining birth rates. Then Technomechanicus called Tau, born to Grimes again in 2022. And then, in 2024 and into 2025, the children who brought the total to 13. Their arrivals confirmed through a combination of reporting, legal documentation, and the occasional Musk acknowledgement offered without elaboration on X, the platform that had become his primary mode of public self-disclosure. The world into which these final confirmations landed was a world that had grown, over the preceding 3 years, both more accustomed to Musk's unconventionality and more politically activated around it. He had become, by 2025, a genuinely polarizing figure in a country that had been sorting itself into camps with increasing velocity. And the question of his family structure, his views on population and reproduction, and the relationship between those views and his public advocacy had become, for journalists and critics and cultural commentators, a subject of intense interest that occupied a complicated space between the legitimately public and the legitimately private. His children were not public figures. Their mothers, some of them, had chosen varying degrees of public life. The architecture of his family was relevant to understanding his worldview in ways that a biographer could not responsibly ignore, and could not responsibly reduce to caricature. The core conflict of this chapter was not primarily external. Musk faced no legal challenge to his family arrangements, no professional consequence from fatherhood at this scale, no institutional obstacle to the reproductive choices he was making. The conflict was internal and philosophical, and it lived at the intersection of his public ideology and his private behavior in a way that he seemed, depending on the moment and the interlocutor, either genuinely unbothered by or actively unwilling to examine. He had been arguing, with increasing urgency and public prominence, that the declining birth rates of developed nations represented an existential threat to civilization comparable to, and in some of his more expansive formulations, perhaps more immediately pressing than, the risks of misaligned artificial intelligence or single-planet human habitation. He posted graphs of fertility rates. He amplified demographers who shared his alarm. He made the connection explicit that the same institutional and cultural forces he was fighting through DOGE and through X and through his political alignment with a particular strain of nationalist populism were also responsible, in his analysis, for the fertility collapse he regarded as civilizational self-destruction. He was simultaneously living out this ideology in the most literal way available to him, fathering children at a pace and across a set of arrangements that had no real precedent in the lives of public figures of comparable prominence. The question of whether this represented admirable consistency, a man who put his most intimate decisions in alignment with his most public convictions, or something more complicated, a philosophical framework that conveniently sanctified what might otherwise be understood as a pattern of relationships with women who were, in several cases, significantly younger than him and professionally connected to his empire, was one that the culture could not resolve cleanly and largely did not try to. His supporters treated the family expansion as evidence of genuine commitment to stated values. His critics treated it as evidence of something they described in terms ranging from grandiosity to exploitation. Neither characterization was entirely wrong. Neither was entirely complete. The revealing action, the moment that opened the keyhole most directly onto the interior of his thinking, came during a long interview he gave in late 2024 to a journalist whose sympathies ran closer to his own than most of the press corps that covered him. He was asked about Vivian. Not by name, the journalist was careful, but by the nature of the situation, the estrangement, and about whether fathering additional children while that estrangement remained unresolved reflected something about how he understood the obligations of parenthood. It was a careful question, reasonably asked. Musk was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. Then he said something that the journalist quoted with what appeared to be precise fidelity, that he believed every life he could bring into the world was a gift to that person, and potentially to civilization, and that the complexity of adult relationships, his relationships, anyone's, was categorically separate from the value of children existing. He said that he loved all of his children. He said that some relationships between parents were irreparable, and that this was a tragedy but not a reason for the children to not exist. He said that he thought about Vivian, that he wished things were different, and that he had concluded he could not let the pain of that situation become a reason to not bring more life into a world that needed more of it. It was, depending on your prior disposition, either a statement of genuine philosophical coherence or a remarkable performance of self-justification, the deployment of civilizational stakes as a buffer against the specific personal weight of a child who had walked into a courtroom and asked a judge to remove his name from hers. What it was not was evasive. Whatever one made of the conclusion, the reasoning was his own, offered without apparent anxiety about how it would land, which was in its way the most revealing thing about it. He was not managing the perception. He was telling you what he actually thought, in the voice of a man who had decided long ago that the gap between his interior and his exterior was a problem other people had, not him. Siobhan Zalice occupied a position in this chapter that was both central and, by the nature of her own preferences, underlit. A Canadian-born former venture capitalist who had joined Tesla's board as an observer before moving to Neuralink, Zalice was, by any professional measure, exceptional. A person who had navigated the most competitive environments in technology with a combination of intellectual capacity and interpersonal skill that had earned her the respect of people who did not give it easily. Her relationship with Musk was confirmed through the 2022 revelation of their children's existence, and she had said almost nothing publicly about its nature or its terms in the years since. A silence that was itself a kind of statement in a media environment that offered continuous incentive for disclosure. What was visible from the outside was that she remained at Neuralink, remained, in fact, in a senior operational role through the turbulent period of the human trials, the regulatory negotiations, and the corporate restructurings that Musk's attention economics periodically imposed on each of his companies. She was present in the meetings that mattered. She was described by colleagues as someone who had not allowed the personal complexity of her situation to bleed into her professional conduct, which was itself a form of extraordinary discipline in an organization where the personal and the professional were, at the highest levels, thoroughly entangled. Her relationship with Musk had, by the accounts of people who observed both of them in professional settings, achieved a kind of stable equilibrium. Not warm in the way that close friendships are warm, not cold in the way that ended professional relationships become cold, but functional in the specific way that two very intelligent people sometimes manage when they have created something together that neither of them can simply walk away from, because the something they have created includes children. She did not speak publicly about the additional children confirmed in 2024 and 2025. She did not speak publicly about much. In an environment saturated with his voice, her silence had the quality of a considered position. The children themselves, all 13 of them, across their various households and arrangements and degrees of proximity to the man whose genetic material and financial resources they shared, were growing up in a world that their father was, in measurable ways, reshaping. They would inherit a planet with more electric vehicles and more orbital launch capacity, and possibly a restructured federal bureaucracy and a more permissive information environment and a range of AI capabilities whose trajectory their father's companies were directly influencing. They would also inherit the specific complexity of being his children, the famous name, the gravitational field of public opinion that surrounded it, and the private reality of a father whose attention was distributed across a portfolio of civilization-scale ambitions that left, by the arithmetic of hours in a day, a quantity of time for individual children that his most devoted admirers would struggle to characterize as sufficient. Musk had addressed this in interviews with the same directness he brought to everything. He said he tried to spend time with each of them. He said the older ones, his sons from the first marriage, were old enough to engage with his work in substantive ways, and that he found this genuinely satisfying. He said that he believed the most important thing a parent could model was the pursuit of something meaningful, and that the children of people who did nothing remarkable were not thereby better served than the children of people who were rarely home. It was, again, a coherent argument. It was also, again, an argument whose primary beneficiary was the person making it. The culture watched all of this with the fascinated discomfort that Musk reliably produced, unable to look away, uncertain what norms to apply, aware that the existing frameworks for evaluating public figures had not been built for someone operating at this particular intersection of the personal and the planetary. 13 children, multiple households, a family structure that resembled, in some of its features, the arrangements of historical figures whose reproductive choices we now read in Biography with the cool distance of the past, and that resembled in other features something entirely without precedent. What no one had yet fully reckoned with, not the journalists, not the cultural critics, not the people closest to him, was what it would mean for those children when they were old enough to read what had been written about their father, and about themselves, and to decide what relationship they wished to have with the empire, and the ideology, and the man who had, with characteristic certainty about what the future required, decided that they should exist. Vivienne Musk, 21 years old in 2025, had already decided. Her siblings were only beginning to learn the question.